A billionaire's daughter falsely accused a black man of forcing himself on her, and the world believed her. Caleb Carter had his entire life ahead of him until one lie stole it all. Framed for a crime he didn't commit, he lost everything, while Savannah, the billionaire's daughter, lived without consequences. But when the truth finally came to light, Caleb didn't just clear his name. He made sure his revenge left everyone stunned. Stay tuned as this extraordinary story unfolds with the twists you would never expect. Tell us in comments where you are watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more gripping stories. Let's dive in. Jonathan Whitmore was a billionaire with power that stretched beyond money. His name wasn't just respected, it was feared. His estate, a sprawling mansion in Los Angeles, was not just a home but a fortress of control, where staff followed rules and disappeared the moment they forgot their place. Caleb Carter had never been the kind of man to take risks. He had worked for Jonathan as his personal driver for 4 years, careful to keep his head down and do his job without complaint. It paid well enough for him to send money home to his mother and plan a future with his fiancée, Rachel Dawson. He had seen what happened when people crossed the Whitmores, and he had no intention of becoming one of them. But no one had warned him that Savannah Whitmore was the real danger. Savannah had been born into a world where consequences didn't exist. As Jonathan's only daughter, she had never been denied anything, never been told no, never faced rejection. She was reckless, entitled, and used to getting exactly what she wanted. And that night, she wanted Caleb. Caleb had just come back from a 12-hour shift, drained from driving Jonathan to meeting after meeting, waiting outside luxury restaurants, and sitting in traffic for hours. The hot shower had been meant to wash away exhaustion, but the moment he stepped out of the bathroom, towel slung around his waist, his breath caught in his throat. Savannah Whitmore was standing in his room. She wasn't startled or embarrassed. She wasn't lost or confused. She was waiting. The silk robe she wore hung loose at the shoulders, her golden hair cascading effortlessly over her frame. The soft scent of jasmine perfume clung to the air, but there was nothing soft about the way she looked at him. It was deliberate, unsettling. A hunter watching prey. Caleb's jaw locked as he tightened the towel around his waist. His body tensed with unease, every instinct screaming that this was more than just a mistake. It was a setup. What are you doing here? His voice was sharp, his exhaustion now replaced by pure alertness. Savannah's lips curled into a slow smirk, her gaze dragging over him in a way that made his stomach turn. Relax, Caleb. I just wanted to talk. His grip on the towel tightened. He had seen wealthy women like her before, ones who liked to play games, ones who used men for amusement, knowing full well they would walk away unscathed while the men paid the price. He had never given Savannah a reason to believe there was anything between them, had never encouraged her, but it didn't matter. This wasn't about what he wanted. It was about what she wanted. You need to leave, he said, voice steady, firm. Now. Savannah took a slow step forward, bare feet soundless against the floor. Or what? You'll tell my daddy. The amusement in her voice sent a chill through him, but beneath it was something darker, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. His gut told him to move, to put more distance between them, but he kept his ground. Savannah, I don't know what game you're playing, but I'm engaged. I love Rachel. Whatever you think is happening here, it's not. Her smirk didn't fade. If anything, she looked even more entertained. Then break it off. His chest tightened with frustration. He had tried to be polite, tried to keep the situation from escalating, but this was dangerous. I don't know what's going on with you, but I want no part of it. Get out. For the first time, something shifted in her expression. The playfulness dimmed, replaced by something sharper, more calculated. You think you're too good for me? Caleb turned away, reaching for his clothes, desperate to put something between them, to get dressed and make it clear that there was no conversation to be had. Before he could react, Savannah grabbed his wrist. The touch burned like an open flame. Her nails pressed into his skin, her grip deceptively tight. He jerked his arm free instantly, taking a step back, his heart hammering. Savannah, stop. His voice was cold now, no longer careful. She did stop, but not in the way he expected. With a single movement, she grabbed the collar of her robe and ripped it at the shoulder. The soft fabric tore like paper, the sound splitting through the silence like a gunshot. Then she screamed. Caleb's blood turned to ice. "Help! Help me!" The cry ripped through the estate, loud, panicked, and horrifyingly real. His stomach plummeted. "What the hell are you doing?" His voice was hoarse, but Savannah only screamed louder, stumbling toward the door, clutching at her robe like a frightened victim. Heavy footsteps thundered down the hallway. Caleb's entire body went numb. The door burst open. Jonathan Whitmore stood in the doorway, his face twisted in pure fury. 2 security guards flanked him, their hands hovering over their weapons. Caleb had half a second to raise his hands before the first punch landed. A fist crashed against his jaw, sending him sprawling to the ground. Pain exploded through his skull, the world spinning violently as he fought to process what was happening. Jonathan's voice was thunderous, merciless. "You lay your hands on my daughter, and you think you'll walk out of here alive?" Caleb gasped for breath, his mind racing for words, for anything that would make this stop, but it was already too late. Savannah's sobs filled the air as she clung to her father, her cries perfectly timed, perfectly convincing. "Daddy, he wouldn't stop," she whimpered, her voice shaking at all the right moments. I told him no, but he wouldn't listen." Jonathan's expression hardened into something cold and final. "Take him," he ordered. "Call the police. I want him out of my house and in a cell before the night is over." Hands grabbed Caleb roughly, yanking him up, twisting his arms behind his back. He struggled, shaking his head, desperation clawing at his throat. "No, she's lying. I didn't touch her." His voice cracked, raw with disbelief, but it didn't matter. Jonathan didn't care. The guards didn't care. No one cared. As the cuffs snapped around his wrists and he was dragged toward the door, Caleb knew the truth with terrifying certainty. He was already guilty in their eyes, and there was no way out. The flashing lights of police cars flooded the Whitmore estate as Caleb was dragged outside, his wrists bound behind his back so tightly that pain shot up his arms. The humiliation of being paraded like a criminal in front of the mansion's towering pillars burned deeper than the bruises forming on his face. His breath was ragged, panic clawing at his chest as he tried to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around him. Jonathan Whitmore stood at the top of the marble staircase, his stance unwavering, his expression cold. Savannah clung to his arm, shaking with sobs that sounded real enough to fool anyone who didn't know better. She kept her eyes down, but Caleb caught the small smirk that flickered at the corner of her lips. She was enjoying this. She was getting exactly what she wanted. "Please, you have to believe me," Caleb begged, his voice hoarse as he struggled against the officer's grip. "I didn't touch her. She's lying." Jonathan's eyes remained locked onto him, unreadable and unmoved. He took slow, deliberate steps forward, stopping just a few feet away. The air between them felt suffocating. "You put your hands on my daughter." His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the rage simmering beneath it. "I don't care what you have to say. You're finished." Before Caleb could respond, the officers forced him toward the back of the squad car, shoving him into the seat as the door slammed shut behind him. He stared through the barred window, watching as the estate shrank in the distance, its glowing lights disappearing into the night. His entire life had been ripped from him in a single moment, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The ride to the police station was a blur. His hands ached from the cuffs digging into his wrists, but the pain was nothing compared to the suffocating dread settling in his chest. He had no proof, no witnesses, no way to fight back against Savannah's lies. In the eyes of the world, her word was truth, and his was nothing. By the time they arrived, the media had already descended on the station. Reporters swarmed the entrance, shoving microphones toward the officers, their voices overlapping in a chaotic frenzy. Cameras flashed, capturing his face, twisting his confusion and fear into the perfect image of guilt. "Caleb Carter, did you assault Savannah Whitmore? Do you have anything to say for yourself? How does it feel to betray the Whitmore family?" He tried to turn away, but there was no escape. The officers pulled him forward, leading him inside, where the cold walls of the interrogation room did little to slow his racing thoughts. His heart pounded as he sat shackled to the metal table, waiting for someone, anyone, to believe him. Detective Marshall entered the room with an air of indifference, tossing a thick file onto the table as he took a seat across from Caleb. His gaze was unreadable, but the weight of his silence made it clear that he wasn't here to listen. He was here to close the case. "You want to tell me what happened tonight?" The detective's voice was even, almost uninterested, as he flipped through the file. Caleb swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I didn't touch her." Marshall sighed, shaking his head as if he had heard the same excuse 100 times before. "That's not what Savannah says." "She's lying," Caleb said, his voice rising with desperation. "She came into my room. She tried to come on to me, and when I told her no, she set me up." The detective's gaze flicked up briefly before returning to the file. "That's not what the evidence says." He tapped the stack of papers in front of him. "We have her statement, the bruises on her wrist, the torn robe, and Jonathan Whitmore pressing charges. You expect me to ignore all of that because you say she's lying?" Caleb's chest tightened as the reality crashed down on him. There was no proof, no security footage in the staff quarters, no witnesses, just Savannah's word against his. And in this world, her word was law. Hours later, they moved him to holding, allowing him one phone call. His fingers trembled as he dialed Rachel's number, the only person he had left. He needed her to believe him. He needed someone to stand by him. The line rang once, then twice before she picked up the Caleb. Her voice was thick with exhaustion, but there was something else there too, hesitation. "Rachel, listen to me," he rushed out. "Whatever you've heard, it's a lie. I didn't do this. You know I wouldn't not." A long silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. "I don't know what to think," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb's stomach dropped. "Rachel, you know me. You know me. I need time to process this," she murmured. His breath came in short, ragged bursts as the reality of her words settled in. "You don't believe me. I have to go." The line went dead. The phone slipped from his grasp, clattering onto the floor, but he barely heard it over the pounding in his head. Rachel had been the one person he thought would stand by him, the one person who would never doubt him. Even she had hesitated. Days blurred together as the legal process moved faster than he could comprehend. Jonathan's lawyers tore through the case with ruthless efficiency, painting him as a predator who had abused his position to take advantage of Savannah. His public defender was barely present, offering weak rebuttals, knowing they had no real chance against the Whitmore empire. When the verdict came, it wasn't a surprise. "Mr. Caleb Carter, this court finds you guilty of sexual assault. You are hereby sentenced to 20 years in prison." The words hit like a sledgehammer to his chest. His mother's wails filled the courtroom. Rachel sat frozen in the back, tears streaking her face, but she didn't move, she didn't speak. She just watched. And Savannah? She sat beside her father, composed, detached. A small smirk ghosted her lips before she turned away, as if he had already been erased from existence. As the officers grabbed his arms and led him out of the courtroom, the weight of what had happened settled in his bones. His life was over. His future was gone. But as he stepped out of the courtroom, shackled and broken, one thought burned in his mind. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. 3 years in prison felt longer than a lifetime. Every day was a reminder of what had been stolen from Caleb Carter. His freedom, his future, and his dignity had all been stripped away by one carefully constructed lie. Time had dulled the shock, but the betrayal still burned just as fiercely. He had lost everything. His mother's health had declined under the stress, and Rachel had disappeared from his life. He had held on to the hope that she would visit, that she would fight for him, but the visits never came. She had believed Savannah's lie, just like everyone else. The trial had been swift, the verdict predetermined before he had ever stepped foot in the courtroom. He was never meant to win. The world had long forgotten him, but there was one person who hadn't. Ella Matthews had never stopped believing in him. She had been Rachel's best friend, but unlike Rachel, she had never doubted his innocence. She had visited him in prison when no one else had, written letters when he had been too broken to speak, and spent every waking moment searching for a way to prove the truth. Then, one evening, everything changed. Ella found a job posting for a cleaning position at the Whitmore estate. It was the opportunity she had been waiting for. Jonathan Whitmore was meticulous about keeping his secrets buried, and no amount of digging had unearthed any evidence that could overturn Caleb's conviction. But if there was anything left, a security recording, a deleted file, anything that told the real story, it would be inside that house. She submitted her application that same night. Days later, she was hired. That evening, she went to the prison to tell Caleb. His face, worn and tired from years of injustice, barely changed when she sat across from him in the visitation room. But when she leaned in and whispered, "I got a job at the Whitmore estate," a flicker of something passed through his eyes. Hope. The Whitmore estate hadn't changed, but Savannah had. She was still the wealthy, untouchable heiress, still spoiled and privileged, but there was something different about her now. The girl who had once been reckless and carefree had grown tense, paranoid. She snapped at the staff more than before, drank more than she should, and carried a weight that hadn't been there 3 years ago. Ella watched her closely, pretending to be nothing more than an invisible maid, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The first few weeks passed with little progress. Jonathan was careful about security, and his office was always locked. He spent hours inside it, going through business files, making private calls, ensuring that whatever secrets he kept were well protected. But on the night of Savannah's birthday, everything changed. The estate was packed with guests, laughter and music filling the halls, champagne flowing freely. For the first time since she had started working there, Jonathan was distracted. He drank more than usual, losing himself in conversation with business partners, while Savannah sat alone at the bar, absent-mindedly stirring her drink. Ella slipped away, heart pounding as she climbed the grand staircase and made her way toward the office. The door was locked, just as she expected, but she had planned for this. Earlier that week, she had stolen a spare key from one of the security offices. Taking a steadying breath, she slid it into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open. The office was dimly lit, the soft glow of the computer screen casting eerie shadows over the polished mahogany desk. Moving quickly, she checked the drawers, her fingers skimming over files, searching for anything that might expose what had really happened that night. But there was nothing, just routine business documents and financial reports. Frustration curled in her chest until she turned back to the computer. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure where to start, until she noticed a folder labeled Security Archives. A spark of hope surged through her as she clicked it open. Dozens of video files appeared, each labeled with dates. She scrolled through them, her pulse pounding, searching for the night that had changed everything. And then, she found it. Hands trembling, she clicked the file. The grainy footage played, and for a second, she could barely breathe. Savannah Whitmore stood inside Caleb's room, the silk robe draped over her shoulders. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't panicked. She was moving closer to him, reaching for his wrist. When he stepped back, his body tense and defensive, she hesitated for only a moment before suddenly ripping the fabric of her robe. Ella's breath hitched as she watched Savannah stagger backward, clutching her robe, a performance so convincing that even in silence, it looked real. Pulling out her phone, Ella recorded the footage, ensuring she had a copy in case something went wrong. But she needed more security. She plugged a flash drive into the USB port and copied the footage. The progress bar crawled forward. Every second felt like an eternity. But just as she finished, the sound of footsteps made her blood run cold. A faint creak came from behind her. The office door had opened. Jonathan Whitmore stepped inside, his movements sluggish from alcohol, his face unreadable. He walked toward his desk, picking up his phone, muttering something under his breath. Ella froze under the desk, barely breathing. She watched as he sat down heavily, rubbing his temple before dialing a number. The phone rang once before he spoke. His voice was calm, but there was a dangerous edge to it. Handle it. No loose ends. Ella's blood turned to ice. They knew. She had to get out. Forcing herself to stay calm, she inched backward, ejecting the flash drive and slipping it into her pocket just as Jonathan turned. He paused, his gaze locking onto the computer screen. His fingers clicked the mouse, pulling up the security logs. Then, his shoulders stiffened. He knew someone had accessed the files. Before she could reach the door, voices sounded from the hallway. They were coming. She didn't hesitate. She bolted. Ella sprinted down the corridor, her breath tight as she clutched the flash drive in her pocket. She had almost reached the back entrance when two security guards stepped into her path. One pressed his earpiece. "We found her." Turning sharply, she fled in the opposite direction, but more guards blocked the way. A slow, deliberate clap echoed through the hallway. Jonathan Whitmore emerged from the shadows, composed and calculating. Savannah stood beside him, but unlike her father, she was visibly shaken. Jonathan exhaled, running a hand down his tie as he assessed her. "I expected better." Savannah's eyes darted to Ella's pocket. "Search her." The guards closed in, yanking her arms behind her before she could react. They patted her down, pulling out both her phone and the flash drive. Jonathan took the flash drive first, rolling it between his fingers. Savannah grabbed the phone, her hands trembling slightly. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, Jonathan turned to Savannah. "Delete everything." Savannah exhaled shakily before slamming the flash drive against the marble floor. The plastic cracked, the metal bent under the force. Ella said nothing. Jonathan unlocked her phone, scrolling through her files. Within seconds, his face darkened. Without hesitation, he threw the phone against the wall. It shattered on impact, screen fragments scattering across the floor. Savannah let out a shaky breath. "It's over," she muttered. Ella lifted her gaze, her lips curling into something close to amusement. Savannah's expression faltered. "What?" Ella's voice was steady. "You think I didn't plan for this?" Savannah stiffened. "She's bluffing." Jonathan's fingers twitched at his side. Then the sirens pierced the night. Savannah's body jerked like a puppet whose strings had just been cut. "No, no, no, no," a voice boomed from outside. "Jonathan Whitmore, this is the police. Come out with your hands up." The front doors burst open. Officers flooded the estate, moving with swift precision. Jonathan clenched his jaw, realizing too late that he had been outplayed. Savannah's breath hitched, her face ghostly pale as officers closed in. Ella exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of 3 years finally lift from her shoulders. It was over. The moment the police stormed the estate, chaos erupted. Officers spread out across the grand hall, their voices sharp and commanding as they secured the scene. Jonathan Whitmore stood rigid, his jaw locked in defiance even as the walls of his empire collapsed around him. Savannah, however, was unraveling. The moment she saw the officers closing in, her legs buckled, and she reached for her father's arm as though clinging to the last shred of control she had left. Jonathan raised his hands as an officer approached, his voice as smooth as ever. "There's been a mistake," he said, keeping his tone measured. "I don't know what you've been told, but my legal team will be." The lead officer, a man in his 40s with a hardened expression, cut him off. "We have video evidence and a sworn statement. You're under arrest for perjury, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to falsify evidence." For the first time, a flicker of something other than confidence passed over Jonathan's face. Savannah gasped, her fingers tightening around his sleeve. "Daddy, do something!" But there was nothing left to do. One of the officers pulled out his handcuffs, securing Jonathan's wrists with practiced ease. Savannah let out a whimper, shaking her head in disbelief as another officer turned toward her. "Savannah Whitmore, you are under arrest for making false accusations that led to an unlawful conviction." Her entire body froze. "No, you don't understand." Her breathing grew shallow, panicked. She turned to her father, but Jonathan was no longer looking at her. His face was blank, his mind already calculating his next move, leaving her completely alone to face what she had done. Ella stood at the edge of the room, watching as reality crashed down on the Whitmores. They had destroyed Caleb's life without a second thought. And now, their own world was crumbling before them. A female officer stepped forward, reading Savannah her rights, but Savannah barely seemed to hear. Savannah let out a choked sob as they pulled her away. For the first time in her life, there was no one left to protect her. 2 days later, in a crowded courtroom, Caleb Carter walked into the world as a free man. The judge had reviewed the new evidence overnight, overturning his conviction in record time. The video of Savannah's staged attack had been irrefutable, and Jonathan's illegal actions to suppress it had only made the case stronger. As Caleb stepped outside, the blinding sunlight hit his face, a warmth he hadn't felt in 3 years. The air smelled different. Freedom had a scent, and it was intoxicating. The world beyond the prison gates was loud, unfamiliar, but he didn't care. He was free. Ella was waiting for him on the courthouse steps, her hands clasped together, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. She had fought for him when no one else had. She had risked everything to uncover the truth. And now, as he looked at her standing there, he knew he owed her his life. Caleb stepped toward her, his throat tightening. "You saved me." His voice was raw, heavy with the weight of everything he wanted to say. Ella swallowed hard, shaking her head. "You deserve to be saved." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Caleb took her hands in his, feeling something shift inside him, something steady, something right. He had lost so much, but maybe, just maybe, this was a new beginning. Then a familiar voice shattered the moment. "Caleb." Rachel stood a few feet away, her face tear-streaked, her hands trembling as she clutched a small velvet box. "I'm so sorry. I should have believed you. I should have fought for you." She hesitated, her eyes flickering toward Ella before she swallowed. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I never stopped loving you." She opened the box, revealing a diamond ring, one almost identical to the one she had thrown away 3 years ago. "Let's start over. Please." Ella stiffened beside him, and Caleb could feel the weight of everyone's eyes watching, waiting for his response. Rachel had abandoned him. She had walked away the moment things got hard. But Ella had stood by him when he had nothing left. Caleb exhaled, stepping back. "You only came back because I'm free now." His voice was calm, but firm. "When I needed you most, you let me rot in that prison, and the only person who fought for me was standing right beside me this whole time." Rachel's face crumpled, her grip tightening around the ring. "Caleb," he turned toward Ella, reaching for her hand. "I already found the woman who stood by me when no one else would." Rachel's lips trembled as she looked between them, realization crashing over her. The tears finally spilled down her cheeks, but this time they weren't enough. She had made her choice 3 years ago, and now Caleb had made his bar. Rachel let out a quiet sob, shaking her head before she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Caleb glanced at Ella, giving her fingers a gentle squeeze. "Thank you for never giving up on me." She smiled softly. "We're a team, Caleb. We always were." For the first time in 3 years, Caleb felt like he could breathe again. The Whitmores had fallen, justice had been served, and as he walked down those courthouse steps with Ella beside him, he knew his real life was just beginning. Jonathan Whitmore was sentenced to 20 years in prison for obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and bribery. Savannah, convicted of perjury and making false accusations, was given 10 years. The Whitmore empire, once untouchable, collapsed as their assets were seized and lawsuits flooded in. Caleb was awarded $6 million in damages, but no amount of money could give him back the years he had lost. Instead of dwelling on it, he focused on building a new life. With his settlement, he bought a home, a place that symbolized a fresh start. He and Ella started a foundation to help wrongfully convicted individuals get the legal help they needed. They dedicated their time to making sure no one else suffered the way he had. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Caleb stood on the porch, watching the world finally slow down. Ella stepped beside him, and he turned toward her, reaching into his pocket. Slowly, he pulled out a small box, opening it to reveal a ring. Not just any ring, but one that held meaning, one that symbolized everything they had been through together. "Ella," he said, voice steady, "I don't want to just thank you for saving my life. I want to spend it with you." Tears shimmered in her eyes, but this time they were the kind that carried happiness, not pain. She nodded, and as Caleb slid the ring onto her finger, he knew this wasn't just an ending. It was the beginning of everything. Caleb finally got justice, but how many innocent people are still suffering in silence, their lives ruined by lies? How do you think society should handle false accusations? Can trust ever be rebuilt after such a betrayal? Let's discuss it in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if this story kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another gripping story. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the truth doesn't just set you free, it changes everything.